When Swamp Loggers first aired, it introduced audiences to Bobby Goodson as a man who seemed perfectly at home in the harsh, unpredictable world of swamp logging. He came across as steady, practical, and deeply rooted in his craft, someone who didn't need theatrics to command respect. Viewers saw long days, heavy machines, and relentless conditions, but Bobby rarely appeared shaken. That image stuck. To many, he became a symbol of hard work and resilience, the kind of person who thrives where others hesitate. When the show ended in 2012, it felt natural to assume that his future would be easier, perhaps even more comfortable. Television exposure often brings new opportunities, from business partnerships to public appearances, but Bobby's story didn't follow that familiar path. Instead of chasing visibility, he returned to the same demanding work that had defined his life long before the cameras arrived. For him, logging was never about performance or recognition. It was about identity, responsibility, and continuity. What remained unseen by most was how quickly the advantages of television faded, leaving him to face an already challenging industry without the added support that fame briefly provided, choosing work over fame. After the final episode aired, Bobby made a quiet but firm decision not to pursue a career in the spotlight. While others might have used the exposure as a stepping stone into broader ventures, he chose to stay grounded in what he knew best. Back in Johnston County, he focused entirely on running Goodson's All-Terrain Logging, a company built on years of experience and family tradition. This wasn't just a business to him, it was part of a legacy passed down through generations. He kept his crew close, relying on family members and longtime workers who understood the rhythm and risks of the job. However, without the television presence, the landscape subtly shifted. The visibility that once gave his name extra weight in negotiations began to fade. Contracts that once seemed within reach required more effort to secure. Decisions by mills and landowners leaned more heavily on cost efficiency rather than reputation. Bobby found himself navigating a tougher environment, one where loyalty and history mattered less than margins. It wasn't a dramatic change overnight, but a gradual tightening that made each decision more critical than the last. An industry that moved on between 2014 and 2018, the logging industry in the southern United States underwent significant changes. Larger corporations began to absorb smaller operations, creating a more competitive and efficiency-driven environment. For someone like Bobby, whose expertise lay in swamp logging, these changes were especially challenging. Swamp logging requires specialized equipment, careful planning, and a willingness to work in difficult terrain. While it once set his company apart, it gradually became a disadvantage in a market that favored simpler, more accessible timber sources. Mills increasingly chose options that reduced risk and cost, leaving less room for operations like his. At the same time, expenses continued to rise. Equipment maintenance became more demanding due to the harsh conditions, and replacing parts or upgrading machinery was never cheap. Fuel prices fluctuated unpredictably, and insurance costs steadily climbed. Additionally, as local mills closed, transporting timber required longer distances, adding further strain. On the surface, the business still appeared active, but beneath that activity was a growing imbalance between effort and return, the hidden strain. To those around him, Bobby remained consistent, focused on the job and committed to keeping things running. But behind that steady exterior, the pressure was building. Running a logging operation involves constant decision-making under uncertain conditions. Weather, equipment failures, and shifting demand can all disrupt plans in an instant. Each unexpected challenge added another layer of stress. Beyond the practical difficulties, there was also an emotional weight tied to the business. It represented decades of work, family history, and personal identity. Maintaining it wasn't just about income, it was about honoring that legacy. Over time, the strain became harder to ignore. Equipment aged, repairs became more frequent, and financial margins grew thinner. Losses within the crew and the natural wear of time added to the sense that things were becoming fragile. By 2019, it was clear that the operation was operating with very little room for error. One major setback could have serious consequences, and that possibility lingered in the background of every decision. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the arrival of COVID-19 brought an entirely new set of challenges. Industries around the world were affected, and logging was no exception. Mills slowed production or temporarily shut down, which immediately reduced the demand for timber. For a business that depended on steady output and reliable buyers, this disruption was significant. Income dropped quickly, but expenses remained. Loans still needed attention, equipment required upkeep, and insurance costs continued without pause. Supply chain disruptions made even simple repairs more complicated, often delaying work for extended periods. Fuel costs also rose, turning transportation into a heavier burden than before. The balance that Bobby had been carefully maintaining began to shift in a way that was difficult to control. What had once been manageable challenges now felt overwhelming. The numbers no longer aligned in a sustainable way, and the uncertainty made planning nearly impossible. It was a turning point that pushed an already strained operation into a much more difficult position. Fighting to stay afloat. Despite the mounting difficulties, Bobby didn't step away immediately. Through 2020 and 2021, he made efforts to adapt and keep the business going. He looked for smaller jobs, adjusted operations, and tried to reduce costs wherever possible. These decisions required careful thought, as every change affected both the business and the people who depended on it. Inflation added another layer of complexity, driving up the cost of essentials like tires, oil, and replacement parts. Each increase made it harder to regain stability. One of the most difficult aspects was the impact on his crew. These were not just workers, they were individuals who had shared years of effort and experience. Letting people go was never a simple decision, and it carried an emotional weight that couldn't be measured financially. Even with all these adjustments, the gap between income and expenses continued to widen. It became clear that effort alone might not be enough to reverse the situation. Reaching the breaking point. By early 2022, the challenges had reached a level that could no longer be sustained. After nearly 4 decades in the industry, Bobby made the difficult decision to close the company. This wasn't a sudden choice, but the result of years of gradual pressure that had finally reached its limit. Rising costs, reduced demand, and accumulated strain made continuing unrealistic. Selling equipment became a necessary step, even though those machines represented years of hard work and capability. Each piece carried memories of long days and difficult conditions, making the process more personal than it might appear from the outside. Closing the business marked the end of a significant chapter in his life, one that had shaped his identity and daily routine for decades. It was not simply about ending operations. It was about letting go of something deeply connected to who he was and the path he had followed for most of his life. Speaking the truth. When Bobby chose to share his situation publicly, he did so in a straightforward and honest way. There was no attempt to present a polished version of events or to hide the difficulties he faced. Instead, he spoke openly about the challenges, the costs, and the reasons behind his decision. This honesty resonated with many people who had followed his journey over the years. It turned a personal experience into something more relatable, highlighting the realities that many in similar industries quietly face. His words reflected both fatigue and clarity, a recognition of what had changed and what could no longer be sustained. The response from the public was one of understanding and respect. By sharing his story, he not only explained his own situation, but also shed light on broader challenges within the industry. It became more than an individual moment. It became a reflection of a wider experience shared by others. Life after logging. Stepping away from logging required a significant adjustment. For decades, Bobby's life had been structured around the demands of the job, from early mornings to long days in difficult conditions. Without that routine, there was a noticeable shift in how his time was spent. He began focusing more on family and personal life, areas that often take a back seat in physically demanding professions. This transition wasn't immediate or effortless. When work has been central to identity for so long, stepping away can leave a sense of absence that takes time to understand. However, it also created space for reflection and a different kind of balance. The pace of life slowed, offering opportunities to appreciate moments that might have once been overlooked. While the challenges of the past didn't disappear, they became part of a broader perspective. Adjusting to this new phase required patience, but it also brought a quieter sense of stability. A legacy that endures. Even though the company closed, the legacy it created didn't simply vanish. It continues through the people who were part of it and the work that was accomplished over the years. Family members and former crew still carry forward the knowledge and experience gained during that time. The story of the business remains an important part of their shared history. Bobby's journey reflects more than just the rise and fall of a company. It highlights how dedication, skill, and perseverance can shape a life, even when circumstances change. The impact of those years extends beyond financial measures, influencing relationships, values, and personal growth. While the industry evolved in ways that made continuation difficult, the effort and commitment invested over decades remain meaningful. This legacy is not defined by how the story ended, but by the consistency and integrity that guided it. Laver KH the way. strength in letting go. One of the most challenging aspects of Bobby's journey was recognizing when it was time to step away. Continuing might have seemed like the natural choice, especially given the years of effort invested. However, there comes a point when persistence alone is not enough to overcome changing conditions. Letting go required a different kind of strength, one that involves accepting reality rather than resisting it. This decision was not about giving up, but about understanding what was sustainable and what was not. It allowed him to preserve what mattered most: his well-being, his family, and the values that guided his work. There is a quiet dignity in making such a choice, even when it involves closing a long-standing chapter. It reflects a deeper form of resilience, one that acknowledges limits while still honoring the journey. In that sense, his story is not just about loss, but about clarity and thoughtful decision-making.